Palestinian stone throwing refers to a Palestinian practice of throwing stones at people or property. It is a tactic with both a symbolic and military dimension when used against heavily armed troops, while stone throwing is a form of violence. The majority of Palestinian youths engaged in the practice appear to regard it as symbolic and non-violent, given the disparity in power and equipment between the Israeli forces and the Palestinian stone throwers, with many considering it a method of deterring Israeli military forces and civilians from the occupation of Palestinian lands. In Israel it is considered criminal because it is potentially lethal, and it is argued that in some cases it should be treated as a form of terrorism, or that, in terms of the psychology of those who hurl stones, it is intrinsically aggressive. It has also been described variously as a form of traditional popular protest, guerrilla tactic or action, as a form of hate crime or terrorism, or mode of civil disobedience which came to prominence during the First Intifada. At least 14 Israelis have been killed by Palestinian stone throwing, including 3 Arabs mistaken for Jews. It has occasionally been imitated by activists among the Arab citizens of Israel. Stone throwing is not considered a deadly force in most countries. In the West, firearms are generally not used in crowd or riot dispersals, and proportionality of force is the norm, except where immediate danger to life exists. Stone throwers also employ catapults, slings and slingshots armed with readily available materials at hand. Stones, bricks, bottles, pebbles or ball bearings, and sometimes rats or cement blocks. Slingshots are often loaded with large ball bearings instead of stones. Since the 1987 uprising, the technique is favored as one which, to foreign eyes, will invert the association of modern Israel with David, and her enemies with Goliath, by casting the Palestinians as David to Israel's Goliath. Despite there having been frequent acts of protest all over the Palestinian territories, the number of shooting incidents has been less than 3%. Nonetheless, the international press and media focused on the aspect of Palestinian stone throwing, which garnered more headline attention than other violent conflicts in the world, so that it became iconic for characterizing the uprising. According to Edward Said, a total cultural and social form of anti-colonial resistance by the Palestinian people is commodified for outside consumption simply as delinquent stone throwing or mindless terroristic bombings. The Israeli Penal Code treats Palestinian stone throwing as a felony, with a maximum penalty if convicted of 2 years imprisonment. A law has been proposed to extend this to a maximum of 10 years for stoning cars, even without proof of intent to endanger passengers, and 20 years for throwing stones at people, without proof of intent to cause bodily harm. History, cultural context and historical precedents. The practice of stone throwing has deep religious, cultural and historical resonance, and is grounded in the age-old use of slinging stones among young rural herders whose task it was both to keep watch on livestock, and ward off predators of family flocks, and to hunt birds. A Palestinian legend has it that after the creation God sent the angel Gabriel to distribute rocks all over the world, but he tripped on entering Palestine and spilled most of his load over that country. Children learned to use the same kind of sling employed by David to kill Goliath, and stone throwing has been, according to Jonathan Cook, an enduring symbol of how the weak can challenge the strong. From the verse of Ecclesiasticus, a time to gather stones and a time to scatter, stones themselves evoke different traditions, from Jewish mourning and the rite of Tashlich to ultra-Orthodox Jewish stone throwing to protest violations of the Sabbath or Palestinians in protests or to defend the Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem, whose first king, David, slew Goliath with a single stone, and where the practice of stoning prophets, or those condemned to death, was frequent. Religious dissensions in the city repeatedly exploded into vicious stone-throwing matches. It was a shared Muslim and Jewish tradition in Palestine, noted by travelers, to hurl stones at the tomb of Absalom for rebelling against David. Meir and Benveniste likened the very way Jewish, Christian and Muslim communities use their traditions to stone throwing. The Chronicles of Jerusalem are a gigantic quarry from which each side has mined stones for the construction of its myths and for throwing at each other. Gaza, where the First Intifada broke out, has had a long history of stone throwing, which, according to Oliver and Steinberg, goes back at least to an incident where Alexander the Great, while laying siege to the city, was hit by a stone, and almost lost his life. The medieval Christian pilgrim Fabry wrote that 1483 pilgrims took care to arrive in Gaza at dusk to avoid being stoned by the little Muslim boys. According to historian Benny Morris, the practice of throwing stones at Jews is a venerable one in the Middle East, symbolic of Jewish degradation under Muslim rule. Morris quotes a 19th-century traveler: "I have seen a little fellow of 6 years old, with a troop of fat toddlers of only 3 and 4, teaching them to throw stones at a Jew." William Shaler, American consul to Arab Algiers from 1815 to 1828, reported that the practice of Muslims throwing rocks at Jews was commonly seen. The practice of Arab rioters throwing stones at Jews was seen in the 1948 anti-Jewish riots in Tripolitania, Libya. It has been used as a weapon against colonialism in other Arab countries. To modern Palestinians in Gaza, their practice is likened to ancient precedents in Islamic history. Their media draw an analogy between their situation and that of the people in Mecca, when the Christian Ethiopian king of Yemen, Abraham al-Ashram, launched an attack on the city and the Kaaba in 571 CE, the year of Muhammad's birth. The Quran al-Filsara recounts that elephants were deployed in the assault, and birds loaded with stones repulsed the attack. Numerous Palestinian poems and popular songs celebrate the heroism of children who throw stones, and in some of them the imagery of this episode in the Quran is deployed so that America is compared to the elephant herd, while Palestinians are assimilated to the stone-throwing birds. "And we are making war with black stones, so to whom will be the victory, Abraham al-Ashram or Muhammad? American will make war on us with airplanes, tanks, and dollars and collaborators and incompetents and mercenaries, and we will make war on them with the sword of Salah ad-Din, and we will know the duration of the darkness. It is impossible to blot out the moon of the poor, it is impossible to extinguish the sun of the bereaved." According to one hadith or saying ascribed to Muhammad by Abdullah b. Mufaffil al-Mazani, the Prophet of Islam prescribed stone throwing, saying, "It neither stops a game nor inflicts injury on an enemy, but rather puts out the eye and breaks the teeth." Many Palestinians take the tradition as harking back more directly to the peasant revolt that broke out in the wake of the Egyptian-Ottoman War when Ibrahim Pasha invaded Palestine and imposed harsh taxation and conscription policies on the local Falahan. Mandatory Palestine stone throwing played an important, if secondary role, after firearms. In the 1936–39 Arab revolt in Palestine against the British mandatory government, in October 1936 a collective punishment ordinance was invoked to impose punitive measures on villagers implicated in stone throwing against passing vehicles. The Nablus District Commissioner Hugh Foote posted a notice warning that not only boy stone throwers but also their fathers and guardians would be punished. British mandatory forces shot into a milling crowd when stones were thrown at Berkeley's Bank in Nablus in October 1933, as Palestinian Arabs went on strike and demonstrated out of fears they would be replaced by a nation of Jewish immigrants, large numbers of whom had recently entered the country. Several protesters were wounded. On the same day, in Haifa, 4 protesters among a stone-throwing crowd swarming around a police station were killed. Similar incidents occurred in Jaffa. In all, 26 Palestinian Arabs were shot dead, and a further 187 wounded as the nationwide strike was suppressed. In Gaza, one British railway official was killed in 1937 when he left his car to observe stone throwers. Another escaped for such attacks by showing he was not circumcised. The practice was not limited to Gaza. A British police officer reflecting on the period of the Thora remarked, "Arabs for some reason can throw a stone more accurately than anyone else in the world. They rarely miss." Jews also used this tactic. When it was reported in Palestine that the British Foreign Minister Ernest Bevin declared that Britain had never undertaken to establish a Jewish state, but rather a Jewish home, the news was received with outrage, and led to Jewish riots in Tel Aviv. On the 14th of November 1945, the megaphones blared, "Disperse or we fire," towards a milling crowd of Jewish stone throwers. Care was taken to shoot over their heads, and they dispersed without injury, relocating to another suburb to continue the riot. 1967 to 1987. After the Six-Day War left Israel in belligerent occupation of the Palestinian territories, stone throwing occasionally emerged as a form of social protest. The occupation authorities instituted an Israeli juvenile military court in the West Bank to handle children caught in, or suspected of involvement in, such disturbances. In clashes with Israeli forces, students would be detained for beatings, subject to a brief trial on charges of stone throwing, and fined before they were released. Protests among Israel's Palestinians at times also quickly turned into stone-throwing demonstrations at towns like Nazareth, when Mubarak Awad, a Gandhian pacifist, set up workshops as part of his Palestinian Center for the Study of Nonviolence to teach nonviolent forms of resistance in the early 1980s. Many Palestinians reacted negatively to his criticism of the traditional practice, though advocating that Palestinians throw flowers not stones, to protest the occupation. He was deported for putatively fomenting civil disobedience in the early months of the First Intifada. In this period, Palestinian university students played a major role in the organization of stone throwing and other disturbances. First Intifada rock throwing and mass demonstrations had played no part in Fatah's previous guerrilla activities, and the uprising came as a complete surprise to the PLO. Stone throwing, which had been intermittent and confined locally, broke out on a large, systematic, organized and spontaneous grassroots scale and took root with the First Intifada in December 1987 after 2 decades of Israeli rule, becoming the major symbol of the Intifada itself. Those who participated, among the best educated in the Middle East, took to brandishing their banned national flag and throwing rocks and Molotov bombs at IDF forces, to express their frustrations at limited opportunities after decades of growing up under Israeli occupation. It has been called the first stone-throwing rebellion against Israel. Shame and guilt for not doing enough to help their parents or free their land also played a motivational role. Palestinians had access to some arms. They shot collaborators within their ranks, but decided to abstain from organized violence, except for stone throwing. Palestinians at the time, it is argued, were certain that Israel would not respond with gunfire if they limited their revolt to stone throwing. The choice of stones caused a rift in the human rights world, with some human rights theorists justifying it as largely symbolic, others, like Mubarak Awad, more critical. One Israeli general dismissed the idea that stone throwing was terrorism. It was typical of a national movement. Others noted at the time that the practice had not incurred any fatalities among the Israelis, despite several million stones being hurled. What the practice did, it was theorized, was to set up to the rebellion in terms of the David versus Goliath scenario. The guerrilla tactics were partially inspired by the feats of the Afghan insurgency against the Soviet Union and by various colonial uprisings such as the Algerian War of Independence against France, but also relied on a perception that Israelis would not, like Jordanian, Syrian and Algerian armies, send in tanks to demolish entire villages, resisting temptations to resort to small arms warfare in the face of the vast military resources of the Israeli armed forces. Palestinians took to throwing stones, an improvised weapon which had deep symbolic resonances of a cultural, historical and religious kind. As a popular song at the time put it, the stone became their Kalashnikov. Marfikov al-Hijar sa Kalashnikov. Another popular refrain runs Sabanar Kthir Bidnathar by al-Dafer w Kalalqita by al-Moklatar w al-Makla Thora Thora Shabia. Throwers ranged from small children to adolescent youths. The former resented being classified as children, and asserted they also were shabab. Those who were killed by Israeli fire are called martyrs. Participation required little organization, and had an element of spontaneity. Dina Matar, from the refugee camp of Dasher, recalls one was told to watch the street, and then join in stone throwing. Aged 14, she was shot in front of school in Beit Jala by a dum-dum bullet below the ankle, leaving her leg 4 cms short. At the same time, leaflets did circulate asserting that every child must carry the stone and throw it at the occupier. Schoolchildren in the Jenin refugee camp created a game where Jews used guns and Palestinians threw stones, with the latter always winning. It was in large part sustained by youths motivated by a moral sense of urgency to replace the occupation with some form of a Palestinian national entity. To throw a stone was to throw a piece of the land of Palestine at the occupiers. The stones of the land, so crucial to the Israeli sense of history, were gathered into caches to become the weapons of resistance. There was also, according to Muhammad Hakel, an unconscious analogy with the ritual stoning that pilgrims on the Hajj perform at Mina, in which the devil is stoned symbolically 49 times. Though Palestinian Christians tended to be somewhat less prone to stone throwing during the Intifada, preferring other forms of protest like resistance to paying taxes to Israel, the Catholic priest, Fr. Manuel Musalem, hailed the stone throwers as nation builders, the granite youth of Palestine. Dr. Gariz S. Khoury, in his theological work Intifadat al-Samar Intifadat al-Ard, while arguing for a non-violent challenge to the occupation, likened the uprising to Christ's search for social fairness, and praised stone throwing by children as an extension of Jesus' struggle for justice. The conflict was known as the War of the Stones, and Palestinians still call children who grew up during the First Intifada children of the stones. When a tax was imposed on all Palestinian vehicles in Gaza and the West Bank, while exempting cars driven by settlers, Palestinians dubbed it the stone tax, believing that it was a punitive measure to retaliate against the widespread stoning of Israeli cars in the Palestinian territories. Second Intifada. In the Second Intifada, the generally non-violent methods of the earlier uprising gave way to more brutal methods against both IDF troops and Israeli citizens. Stone throwing as the hallmark of resistance yielded place to martyrdom operations, overwhelmingly conducted by Hamas and Islamic Jihad. The Intifada broke out with rock throwing to protest Ariel Sharon's visit to the Haram al-Sharif on 28 September 2000, which led to a clash in which 6 Palestinians were killed, and 220 wounded by Israeli gunfire, while 70 Israeli police were injured by stoning. The incident rapidly escalated into the Second Intifada when, as rock and Molotov cocktail throwing continued over the next 2 days, 24 Palestinians were shot dead, and an Israeli soldier was killed. At the outset, participating teenagers resumed the traditional stone throwing to deny vehicles access to settlements. Israel's response was, according to Lev Lewis Grinberg, to use all the weapons in its arsenal, including snipers, and shooting missiles from Apache helicopters at demonstrators and buildings. He concludes, it responded with disproportionate force that only an army can unleash totally out of place against stone-throwing civilians. Human Rights Watch documented early that IDF soldiers were shooting, stone-throwing youths where no serious threats to their safety existed. According to IDF statistics, in the first 3 months, 73% of incidents, some 3,734 attacks by Palestinians, did not involve the use of arms. 82 of the 272 Palestinians shot dead in these clashes with the IDF were minors. Of the 10,603 Palestinians wounded over the same time, 20% by live ammunition and roughly 40% by rubber bullets, 36% were minors. One of the iconic images of the Second Intifada was of a little boy in Gaza confronting an Israeli tank and winding his arm up to throw a stone from his sling. Snipers were used to put down stone throwers within Israel at Al-Fam inside Israel during the Al-Aqsa Intifada. When news of the killings reached Nazareth on Yom Kippur, a strike was declared, which was, according to one local report, met by hundreds of Israelis from Nazareth Alit who began to stone Palestinian houses. Police were called and hundreds of Palestinian Israelis were arrested, while the youths from Nazareth Alit were reportedly left alone.